Did Paul just came home?
Got home late last night, yeah.
Any trouble? Or she having
Yeah.
trouble?
She missed one flight.
And then it's a domino effect, yeah.
So it was late when she got home, which is better late than never, I guess, right?
Yep. And you know, they learn to navigate that travel stuff. My kids are so much better at it than I am. It's amazing. See, she wasn't coming home in a blizzard.
Right. Yeah, it was all good.
I'll find it. I'll find it. We just kind of start going up all these options. This is it, one more. Well, we'll move it to you right when you want. No, I saw you throw
So,
that.
Trudy wanted to back off on the Water Conservation Committee and not be the
I
chairman.
suppose we could put some.
And
Okay.
Kevin offered to
We make options.
do it, Kevin Smith. You okay with that?
Stand close, okay. We can do that.
I am,
Put
but
that up, that's how we make
Yeah,
our.
at the committee is.
I haven't had very good luck on committee assignments lately.
That or flip and phone.
Oh, well, he'll just pick it up, I mean, it's
I
the,
don't have to appoint it then.
no,
That's a good
no,
question.
I just
Okay.
want to clear it with.
Yeah.
No. Because I'll probably announce it, but I want you to know ahead of time if you were, make sure you.
Right,
look at this.
right, I didn't know what the process was.
We will answer that
Win some,
question.
lose some, Paul, you'll be just fine. Is Tammy feeling better?
Yeah, she's on the phone right now.
I thought I saw her Jeep out there, it's pretty hard to miss that.
Yeah.
No, it should work. No incognito.
We made her sit on the other side of the table for today.
Yeah, good idea.
There's some people who didn't sit next to her.
Whoa. Okay, ready to get going?
Sure.
We'll call to order the special meeting of the city council on December 19th. Roll call, or Christina?
Yep, Clark.
Here.
David. Fish.
Here.
Jorgensen. Cole.
Here.
Parsons. Mayor Lumber.
Here. Approval of the agenda.
So moved. Second.
Motion second to approve the agenda as presented. All those in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carried. No community input, public comment. Get right into our agenda then, which is water rates as presented by AE2S.
Hi, good evening. I'm Miranda Clevin. You probably remember me. I was here not that long ago. So the last time we got together, we spent a lot of time talking about some upfront kind of background and water use data. Can't see what the button is. So I think, this time around, I know you've received some additional information. I'm not sure it was a lot. I'm not sure you had time to review it, but I thought we could just jump right into talking about the scenarios that we've put together, what the basis is for those, what the pros and cons of those are, and so you could work through those things with me tonight. So tonight I'm hoping that we can get some direction on, the desired approach you want to take to incentivizing residential water use reduction, as well as getting your consensus on how you want to treat the non-residential water use, so we can move to some final rate recommendations. So just backing up a minute to the last time I was here, the things that I heard from you were that you were very much in favor of implementing inclining blocks for all users, because conservation is a objective for all of your water use. There was concern, though, about, we want to avoid penalizing the larger families and those that maybe don't have the option to reduce their water use, and that you did like the idea of a fourth tier for that really excessive water use. So we've incorporated all those ideas here in what I'm going to show you today. So just, very briefly, by way of background, is just a reminder then that in June of 2018, looking at the data, about 32% of the accounts used almost 60% of the water. So I think you're all familiar with how water use is playing out in those summer months, and that is the time that is really driving you to need to make some investments in your treatment facility. So we're going to be focused on that primarily. So most of the discussion and most of the decisions, not all, but most of the decisions come in to the volumetric rate discussion. And so I thought I would just start with the fixed rate discussion, which is simpler. We can get that out of the way, and then we can talk about volumetric rates. So if we look at this table, you see your current monthly fixed charges in that second column there. In the fifth column is what we've calculated if we incorporate all of your customer-related O&M costs and a portion of your capacity. We calculated an increase from $7.85 for that lowest meter size to $9.25 to cover your O&M. That is, it's a little more than $2 a month for that lowest meter size, so that we thought that was reasonable. In addition, because you are going to need to start a debt surcharge revenue stream as well, and really, in a perfect world, it would be nice to be able to collect your revenue to pay your debt all from fixed charges. However, that's very hard on the lowest water users, and so it's not the most fair way to do it, but it is very common to do a portion on fixed and a portion on variable. So we're suggesting here that you start out in year one with a $1 a month on those lowest meter sizes, and then scale that up according to the same scale to which the O&M costs have been subject to under your O&M rate. So for a total recommended 2020 rate, fixed rate from $7.85 to $10.25, so a $2.40 per month increase for that smallest meter, and then as the meter sizes increase, it gets to be a little larger. I do want to point out that you currently don't have any 4 and 6 inch meters that I could see in your user classes, and so those big increases, don't really impact anybody at this time. It's good that you have those rates in place. Were you to get a large user coming in, then you would already have that in place.
I have a question. So is this is currently what we're charging? How does this compare to, do you have a regional map of everybody else's rates?
I do.
How high, how low?
Yes.
What are you looking at?
That's kind of it's more towards the end. And I didn't make a table of that, but here I can skip to that and show you.
That benchmarking was
The benchmarking, yeah, this page here. So the blue portion of that line is the fixed part. And so if you see, where's my...
I was curious how that's one thing I always hear from citizens is that our water rates
Right.
are so high. So I'm just trying to...
So right now,
Sure.
right here, you're at 780, 785. And so you see the blue bars are, yours is one of the smaller ones.
Okay.
And so even if you jump down, this is the 1025 here, you're still comparatively on the good side.
Compared to Brookings, Madison, those are really high.
Right, yep. So, but that's for 2020, I guess. As we look into the future, we are going to suggest that you increase that again, over time. But for now, you compare very well in that way. Are there any questions on the fixed charge before we move on? I did want to point out that the way we have this annual debt service surcharge phased in between the fixed and the variable rates at this time, on average, over the repayment period, the average annual debt surcharge that would come from the fixed portion of the rate is around 35, just under 35% on average. More in some years, less than others. In this first year, it's 12.5%, but on average, it's about 34.5%. Okay. Okay, so these fixed charges are going to be taken into account as I show you the volumetric rate scenarios. I'm going to show you actual calculated rates to meet revenue adequacy in 2020. Those are assuming these fixed charges are implemented. So, as I introduce the scenarios here that, like I said, you've already seen in your handout, I did want to just again revisit really briefly the single-family residential water use and the fact that, you know, it varies quite, you know, from annual average. In the chart at the top, the red bar is the monthly average over the course of the year. The green is the winter average, and then the purple is the summer average, and that's at these given water usage amounts across the bottom. It shows you what percentile, for, you know, 6,000 gallons on an annual average, that would capture users up over the 70th percentile on a monthly basis. For winter, it would capture even more than that. More than 80% of the users would use less than 6,000 gallons or less per month. And in the summer, it would be right around 60% of the users. And so you're going to see as we look at the bigger residential users, the multifamily types, that the pattern is going to be quite a bit different. Those bars will be very similar. So we might want to reference back to this, but I just wanted to have that for your information in your packet. So here are the 4 scenarios that I'm going to go through with you tonight. They're similar to what we discussed the last time I was here, and really where they're, you know, for the residential units less than 4 or greater than 4, excuse me, I'm going to refer to that as multi-user type of properties. We took the same approach under all 4 scenarios for that class. The same with the non-residential. We just assumed the tier blocks, as shown here, would be were a good, solid recommendation for all of the different single-family residential scenarios. Same thing with non-residential greater than 80,000 gallons per month on a winter average basis. We also have 1 scenario for that. So it's really for the single-family residential and then the sprinkler accounts where we're going to have some different scenarios to think through this evening. So if we start with single-family residential, this is another graphic just illustrating water use and the how that breaks out. 6,000 gallons, for instance, the red line is as a percentage of total accounts using 6,000 or less. And this is again based on 2018 data, so 20.7% of the accounts would be captured at a tier size of 6,000 gallons. The blue line is the percentage of total flow for the whole utility, and so flow up to 6,000 gallons is 30. Oh boy. I'm having trouble reading this again. 38.4% of total flow. And then residential water use at 6,000 gallons is greater than 50% of total residential flow. So this will show you, this will give you some guide as you consider where you want to break that first tier. If you were to break it at 6,000 gallons, those are the people that you would capture in that first set of percentages. At 8,000, you can see how many more you would capture. At 10,000, you see once you get out to 16,000, you really, you know, there's not a significant change between some of those larger numbers. And so really, for 2018, I didn't see any significant water use in excess of 20,000 gallons. So the data that I'll show you for these single-family users with less than 4 units will only compare up to 20,000 gallons. So for scenario 1, so really, you know, the tier 1 and 2 sizing is kind of the biggest deal, I think, in terms of rate design. You know, what do you want? How do you want to define your first tier? We talked about last time how sometimes that is strictly indoor water use. In your case, average winter indoor water use for this class is around 4,000 gallons. But for the sake of including, being sure we include all winter indoor water use for that class, as well as maybe a little bit of outdoor use for some of those very smallest users, we chose 6,000 for the cutoff for under scenario 1. We looked at 8,000 for scenario 2 to address some of the bigger families and the winter use that they might see. Scenario 3 really represents a philosophy where we're not just interested in only indoor water use in Tier 1, we also want to provide for some watering. So Scenario 3 includes some outdoor use in that first tier, and then so does Tier 4. So the basis for that first scenario is the average use, average summer and median use at 6,000 gallons, and so this captures about 73% of the residential accounts would be captured in that first tier. The smaller the Tier 1 size, the lower the rate the lower rate you'll be able to charge for that class. That's a benefit to those fixed income, 1 and 2,000 gallon per month elderly users, let's say, because you're not selling a lot of water. You're selling more in the higher tiers, and so you're able to keep that Tier 1 rate low, and that's why we like to include one small tier example just for consideration of that. There would be very little lawn watering or garden watering in that scenario 1. In scenario 2, this, again, the Tier 1 rate would be less than for 3 and 4. And the other benefit of those first 2 scenarios is by keeping by sizing those tiers smaller, you allow them to make the choice at keeping their bill lower. If the first tier ends at 30,000 gallons, they don't have any ability to lower their bill because all the water costs the same up to 30,000. Under these smaller tier, they're able to willingly make the choice to water and knowing they're going to spend a little bit more for that water. So that's a nice benefit to the consumers. In the third scenario, we estimated a reasonable amount of lawn watering for a 7,500 square foot property within the city. I know that's a pretty small property size, but that would allow for not only indoor water use, but also some amount of lawn watering within that first tier. And then at 20,000, that allows for what would be considered a reasonable amount of watering for a 10,000 square foot lot. And the thing to note, I guess, the bigger that first tier gets, the less of an incentive there is to cut back because the water is the same price. And it's the lowest price, so lawn watering doesn't cost any more on a per gallon basis than indoor water use.
There's such a big jump between scenario 2 and 3 in what the usage limit is. Is there a reason that was taken so abruptly?
I think, the idea of the first 2 scenarios were to capture indoor water use in just a little bit of outdoor watering, and scenario 3 then was meant to actually have a mathematical basis, and so it was just associated with a 7,500 square foot property size. So you're wondering about like a 12 or a 10?
Yeah, well, just like you wanted to have a compromise. It was kind of like they can't do outdoor watering or they can do outdoor watering in Tier 1. It's like maybe it should be somewhere in the middle.
Sure.
What was your number that we looked up? Do you remember that month that you had water 3 times? I just want to make sure we keep it realistic.
Was that at the last meeting?
Yeah.
Was it 30? I remember it was a surprising number.
Highest last was 22.
Okay.
From 11 to 22
We do pay
for water.
often.
That's the summer use.
But I mean, 22, even Tier 4, or even the scenario 4, I'm not looking at it. I don't see you as a household that uses water.
Okay, yep, no, those are all the kinds of things that we need to talk about and consider in this. So, like I said, the first two approaches are more considerate of the lower volume users in terms of addressing affordability and allowing movement between the tiers. And the last two scenarios are just, they're going to be less effective at reducing overall water use, but they will still have an incentive. So, you know, they would not be unreasonable. So then when we talk about tier 2, we calculated, let's see, 12,000 gallons was what we calculated as a reasonable watering for a 7,500 square foot lot, assuming an inch, you water an inch a week and you get half an inch of rain per week roughly. And so for the first three scenarios, we simply just added 12,000 gallons onto the tier 1 volume to get to there. In the fourth scenario, we added 15,000 gallons to address reasonable lawn watering for a 10,000 square foot lot. And again, these are just, we wanted to have some basis to describe for this. It could be, you know, it could be a bigger number than that. I think we had talked about, you know, 30-ish thousand gallons for the, what was it, a point, you know, a larger lot in town, more representative of the average. The bigger lots in town was quite a bit more. I mean, it was 24,000 gallons, I believe, per month. So again, it just depends on the approach you want to take to that irrigation water use. And so these are those calculations, just showing you how at 7,500 square foot property, if indoor water use per month is 4,000 gallons and we add on 12 for outdoor water use, that's how we get to 16 then. And for the 10,000 square foot property side and the size and the 20,000 square foot property size. So when we look at how we would price these under the scenarios as they've been laid out here. So for the scenario 1, where we have 6,000 gallons and then we add 12 on to get up to 18 for that second tier. And then just for the sake of you know, keeping it simple, we added another 20,000 gallons on for that tier 3 to bring it up to a total of 38,000 gallons, which would above which would be charged the tier 4 rate. And like I said, I didn't see any single family residential users, or not very many at least, that would fall in that tier 4, but we don't want anybody to be buying water in the tier 4. In terms of how we price these from tier 1 to tier 2, we put a 25% step between the tier 1 and tier 2 price, another 25% between tier 2 and 3, and then a 40% increase between tiers 3 and 4, because again, we really don't want people buying water in that top tier. So you can see if we calculate the revenue we need for 2020 based on the test year that we developed, we could start at $437 for tier 1. $546 then would be the tier 2 rate, $683 would be tier 3, and then a $9.56 rate for that top tier under the scenario 1. For scenario 2, same thing. We priced to get essentially the same revenue. That rate would be a little higher, would be starting at $450 instead of $437, and then again increase 25%, 25%, and then 40% for that top tier. So for tier 3, again, because we'll be selling more water in that first tier, that price goes up to $468. And then again, another 25% for tier 2, another 25% for tier 3, and 40% for that top tier. And then scenario 4 again would because it's the biggest, would have the highest price starting out in tier 1 at $4.77. So I wanted to take a minute to just illustrate the impact of these different sized tiers on users. And because, you know, we're talking about a $2.40 per month increase on the fixed charge, that's going to result in a really, you know, a big increase for the really small volume users. But if you look at, so I took out the fixed charge out of this graphic and just illustrated what the different volumetric rate structures would mean in terms of bill impacts. And so the bottom line there is alternative one. And so you can see in terms of what the user would be paying on their volumetric water, up to 6,000 gallons would be a decrease over what they're currently paying. The same thing under alternative two, it would be less than they're currently paying. Under alternative three, it would be a slight increase, less than 5%. And then the same for alternative four. So in terms of, we'd be exchanging fixed revenue for volumetric revenue for those smallest volume users. When we look at the total bill, we see that we see the impact of that $2.40 per month increase on those lowest volume users. It generates, a large percentage, but it's on a small number. And so you can see how, and I just wanted to illustrate that that's the reason for that big increase on the lower end is the fixed charge.
Where did you get base rate? You're upping that based on the O&M projected for 2020? Where did you get those numbers?
It's the budget, the 2020 budget, and for O&M, it's the 2020 budget. And then we also brought in the debt, the estimated debt for the capital projects in 2019.
So a portion of that is covering debt. The dollar surcharge that you have is not covering all of the debt. It's covering just a portion.
It's covering a portion, and then there.
Go ahead.
No, so ahead. So 925 is covering O&M on the fixed charge. $1 is covering debt, and then on the volumetric rate. A portion is covering O&M. The most significant portion is covering O&M, and then there's a small portion also covering the debt.
Seems like a substantial increase in our O&M. Based on the fact that nothing really happened. We didn't have any people or anything, did we? No.
Let me skip to the end here. I have some extra slides that I wasn't necessarily going to go through, but I have the O&M projections.
You don't need to go through that. Just
What is our current rate?
Well, I guess I don't have 2019.
so,
75?
No, not the base, the per thousand gallons.
Volumetric is
$4.59.
Do we have some deferred O&M based into that rate? Things that we need to do that we haven't been able to do before?
No, just normal expenditure for 2020 for operations of the water system. I don't think there's anything in there.
But everything from here, all the water stays with water, right? So like we had to fix, like all our water, that money stays with water. We don't use it for something else, right? It all goes to water, right? Yeah, so like the well or whatever, okay.
Doesn't go into that.
Yeah, this is just water revenue requirements. Yep.
People ever bond, like the cities ever bond over it, where the rates more affordable for everyone?
For debt or for O&M?
You don't want it for R&M, but we do for debt.
For debt, yeah.
For debt, you do, okay. And that would kind of
Right.
keep the water rates down.
And we have assumed some debt in here
They
for,
have assumed debt and they have assumed pocket.
Okay.
They have assumed pocket.
yep.
We got 1.3 million for water treatment design.
Oh, yeah,
We're
that's-
paying, we plan on paying our check
So that's included in there.
and the meter change out.
The meter change out.
So that can impact that.
So if I just not seeing this right or something wrong with it, looks like the O&M jumped quite a bit.
I think they just said the 1.3 million in the design for the design.
There's 1.3 million in for the treatment plant design, which we pay out of cash, and then there's 260,000 in there for meter change outs, which we pay by cash. So therefore, 2020 budget is a lot higher, because of those two items.
We are accounting though for the use of cash. So if I were to,
The 1.3, that's not O&M. That's
Okay. So here is the benchmarking graphic that I showed you earlier when we were talking about the fixed charges. But so you can see where you're at currently, and these are all 2019 numbers as reported in our rate survey. And you know, we know that a lot of these systems are they're in the same position as you are, a lot of them are. And so they, if they don't increase annually due to just inflationary cost increases, a lot of them are also facing capital based increases. And so, you know, we always say you're here, if you move up, you know, here's where alternative 1 would put you in versus 19, here's where alternative 2 would put you for a user at 6,000 gallons per month. Here's alternative 3, here's alternative 4. There's a good chance a lot of these folks on this chart will also be moving down the chart in 2020, and so that doesn't necessarily mean that if you chose alternative 4, you would be down here. You know, Pure would probably be joining you. You know, Box Elder's going to be down there because we know they're doing some increase as well. So, you know, it's, I guess in terms of where you're starting from a good spot. That doesn't make the increase feel any better, but sometimes it can be helpful to illustrate this to your ratepayers when talking about these increases.
No, but we just had an increase, what, 2 years ago? What was it?
Water.
Well, other than inflation,
I thought we had a big drop.
we didn't sewer.
Sewer, that's.
Sewer we had,
And that's what you all have to put in perspective. Our water rates are low, our sewer rates are high. Compare it, look at other cities and stuff. So what you're saying is we're starting out low on the water, which is correct.
But I think that's this, what you think?
But if you add it in with the sewer, which is, I mean,
Yeah,
Joe Sixpack it's 1.
right. Yeah.
Like me, like I thought that, I think that's a misconception, I put it all bunched together, so I just feel like they're gonna, like, they're hiding my water again, and they're not gonna realize it.
Yeah, and we try to explain that during meetings, that here's sewer and water, it's 2 different rates. Because we catch a lot of flack, the water rates for, Bannock County water is so low. Well, yeah, they don't have sewer. So you're only comparing, if you want to compare water to water, we can do that. So you're right, there's a lot of people in town that just look at that and go, our water bill is way high.
Yeah.
But it has both.
So water rates, 2013, 14, and 15, we jumped by 3% each year. 2017, 1%, 2018, 1.6. So we have not changed it since 1/1/18.
Sewer, we took up 15% for the next 4 years.
Yeah, that's what, and I think that's the misconception, like, that was mine too, and I think when you talk to people, they just, because it is lumped together. But now with our new good social media presence, hopefully we can get in front of it,
We will have-
you know, get word out there more.
Right, yeah, and that's where it helps to, you know, keep them informed of what you're doing and why you're doing it, and because they're going to have to understand that this is going to take some time. It's not, you're not looking at 1 year either, you know, you're going to be looking at several most likely, so yeah, getting in front of that is definitely a good idea. So what we did for the residential users, the multifamily with greater than 4 units, to them, because they are so, you know, they vary so much based on how many, you know, whether it's a 5-plex, 6-plex, 8-plex, 24-plex. It's kind of hard to structure an inclining block that fits them exactly. So we made these tiers bigger because there's a lot, you know, there's several on the small end. So you can see this is, this chart here is monthly multifamily water use is the blue compared to the green, where you can see for the green, the residential, they're very close. You know, the residential users mostly look, you know, they look very similar to each other. You can see in the multifamily, there's a lot of really small ones, and then you get a good number of usages that are really varied. And again, they're based on the number of units within the properties. And so the other thing that's interesting to note here, and I alluded to this earlier, so if you remember for the single-family residential, the monthly average, the winter average, and the summer average, they all varied. There was quite a bit of difference in those. Here, they're very similar, and whether it's a monthly average or summer or winter. And so I don't know if these properties have irrigation meters or if they just, typically aren't the ones that are doing a lot of the watering. Their peaking factor, which is their maximum use divided by their average use, is 2.0, as opposed to a single-family residential in Brandon, which the peaking factor for that user class is 3.2. And so you can see there is some peaking that goes on here with the multifamily residential, but not nearly to the degree for the single-family residential. So we felt that justifies having, bigger tier volumes to capture those folks as best you can. So we are suggesting 20,000 gallons would capture up to, I believe it was about the 80th percentile of users would be captured in that first tier. Another 15% would be captured up through tier 2 at 50,000 gallons. And then you would capture up to about the 99th percentile at 80,000 gallons for those users. In terms of how, sorry, go ahead. Yep.
How does it work for an apartment? They just build that, does the owner of the apartment pay it all, or is it split out individually between?
It depends.
Just depends on that.
Depends on how the builder built it. Some of them have individual water meters, not a lot. Some of them just have 1 meter for the entire building.
Well, the ones that have a meter for their, it's gonna be residential. The ones that are multifamily with 4 or more units where the owner pays for it, that's what falls in this category. So these would be the landlord or the owner pays for the utilities. That's where it
So the renter just pays his $800 a month and
Yeah.
built into the rent.
So there's no incentive there for them to conserve water? No incentive.
Well, in that case, the incentive would be on the landlord, and that would come in, that's where the irrigation would come in, which is the water that we want them to conserve. We don't necessarily need their apartment dwellers to use less water indoors necessarily. It's that irrigation.
So do we have any large complexes that are using 80,000 gallons?
Let's see. Yes, I looked at that. Yes, we have a few. The top user that I saw in 2018 was 108,000 gallons, 1 month. And that was just looking at 1 year, but it was very, the 99th percentile usage was 65,000, and then the 100th was 108,000. And so there was a few in between there as well, but
It's probably justified by the number of residential units
Right.
in there.
yep.
So that's almost not very fair to them.
You could also take a look at those big residential users, like the apartment buildings out to the west, or even ones by Arby's, and some of them use quite a few. You could consider putting those in the constant block of non-residential with winter average of greater than 80,000, which we haven't got to yet.
Right,
That's just
right.
great.
Yep, I think if you could look at individual, those biggest users, look at their individual monthly water use, and if it's consistent, and if it's above 80,000 in the winter, I think that's a good idea, is pull them with the other group that we're going to talk about here in a minute. So in terms of pricing for these people, we suggested where we assumed that we would use the same tier 1 through 4 prices as for the single-family residential. There with the thought being residential water use is residential water use. the tiers are not, defined the same, and so you could justify not treating them the same, but at this point, for a starting place, we did, have the same steps between the tiers, the 25, 25, and 40% steps, and the same rates. Any questions on that? Okay, the small graphics that are on the side there show, so based on the bills or the accounts for 2018, we looked at the price today for the average use versus the price under these different proposed tier pricing, and that illustrates how their bill would change under the new system. So for scenario 1, the smallest change in bill would be it would actually be a decrease of 2.2%. The biggest increase would be 17.8%. Under scenario 2, the range in change in monthly bill would be from 0.3 to 17.8. For scenario 3, it would be 3.8 to 17.8, and for scenario 4, it would be again a small increase, minus about 1%, and the big up to as high as 18.2%. So that would be, something that we consider as we, get our thoughts together on this. Do we like the idea of having the same, prices by tier for this class, or not? Any questions on that before we talk about non-residential? Okay, so non-residential, it's going to look similar to what we just talked about with the multifamily residential. In some communities, they do treat those large, multifamily type of accounts the same as commercial. I think when you're talking about conservation, it makes sense to treat domestic, residential water use, all residential water use the same, and so for that reason we haven't suggested lumping them together, but that is certainly something you could consider. The other thing that Brian mentioned is we did take a look at, and I think I touched on this briefly at the last meeting, but we didn't talk in detail about it, but for the very largest commercial users that are very steady users, whether it's summer or winter, those are good customers for you. They're not necessarily being inefficient by using a lot of water. That's just the water they need to run their business. And so in that sense, it makes sense to charge a constant block the same rate for all of their water use. It's not a conservation strategy. It's more of a fairness strategy and a little bit of an economic development strategy. But it's also just, it's mostly, I think, fair in that case because they're not causing the peaking that is the issue here. So these graphics illustrate the non-residential water use as compared to multifamily and single family. And I think I shrunk, the first graphic is over the whole gamut, and then I just took a smaller slice so you could see how on that low end, how the water use varies. Because again, this is another class where you have a lot of really, really small users, and then you have some really, really big users, and then you have a variety in the middle. So again, it's quite a mix. I think if you like the constant block structure for those largest users, the one thing I would suggest, if this isn't already a policy, is that for them to qualify for that, I would require that they have an irrigation meter. So you can still get at conservation, since that's the water that we want to target. I have on this slide the peaking factors again showing, how there's a big difference between the peaking for the single family users and the multifamily users, and then how the non-residential users, that peaking factor is really quite small. And that has to do with the fact that they have a lot of users who are really steady eddy, big water. They're not even a lot, but a large portion of the commercial use is from some big consistent water users. So because, to acknowledge the fact that, you know, most of these users are simply using what they need to run their business, and they're just going to fall, you know, at different usage levels, we did shrink the step between tiers for this, so it's almost like setting up a series of constant block rates in a way, but it is still an inclining block. So instead of a 25% change between the tier 1 and 2 and between tier 2 and 3 pricing, we, and in fact, in between 3 and 4, we just did a 10% change. So enough to send a signal if you have a, you know, a small business who does water their berm or something, you know, they will see that, they could see that price signal, it's there, but it's not really very aggressive because, again, these are not the users that are generally creating the peaking in the summertime. The graphics along the side again show the change in monthly bill for each of these scenarios, and I'm glad you have it in front of you because I apologize, it's kind of hard to see the numbers from here. But again, you can see I have the ranges on there of how the lowest versus highest change in pricing under each of the 4 scenarios. So I guess, you know, in talking about the constant block component of this, you know, one of the questions is, you know, we came up with 80,000 gallons. Is that the right number? You know, should it be 60? Should it be 100? 80 captures 15. Was it? I think I counted around 15. Did you take a look? You at 20? 12. Okay. So.
Looking at it, you have it set on the rates anyway, that if they're up to 80, it's the same exact price if you're 80,000 gallons of constant block.
Right.
So, and I looked at the ones between 50 and 80, and there's a few, but there's honestly not many. There's only 6 in that category, so.
Okay.
I think cutting it off at 80 is fine.
Yeah, we did. We suggested that constant block rate be equivalent to the tier 2 rate for each of the respective scenarios. Just to illustrate the impact of, you know, considering constant block for those highest volume users, on these graphics, we have the winter average is in blue we just selected 4 users. The red is the average monthly use, and then are they green or black? The top percentages are what the increase in monthly bill would be for those users under the inclining block structure, the non-residential inclining block structure. The lower percentages that I think are in purple, that is the monthly increase they would see under the constant block structure. So they would still be seeing an increase, you know, similar to what the other users will be seeing. It would just not be, you know, as large. And again, I would require, or I would want to see these people have an irrigation meter installed to pay the irrigation rates for that. So I think last time there was a question about how Brandon compares, you know, in terms of commercial water use rates. So this is from our 19 rate survey again, and this shows we just assumed 18,000 gallons per month of use for this. You can see, so Brandon is right here in 2019 at $48. No, what is that number? I need a telescope. And so you can see under alternative 1, they would actually be, an 18,000 gallon per month user would actually be a little bit less. Here's alternative 2, here's alternative 3, here's alternative 4. So in terms of, you know, staying competitive within the region, you know, similar to on the single-family residential side, you know, you're starting in a fairly good place. In fact, if you know, kind of going back to that fixed charge question earlier, your fixed charge is, you know, one of the smallest if you compare it to your neighbors in the region here. So, you know, particularly for those commercial users, the increase in fixed charge should, you know, it's very reasonable. Any questions or discussion on the commercial or the non-residential scenarios? Okay, so then the last set is the sprinkler rates. And again, so the assumption that we made here was that sprinklers are primarily associated with residential properties. Now, you know, if we're talking about commercial, maybe we would need to have two sets of commercial rates. I don't know, that's something that, you know, that we should discuss, because we set the tiers, for the purpose of discussion here, we set the tiers up to relate to the single-family residential water use, with the exception that we essentially combined the first two tiers, set them at the tier 2 rate for residential, and then went from there. So under scenario 1, you can see that tier 1 includes 18,000 gallons, because that is the price that, you know, in theory, a single-family residential user under scenario 1, if they're sprinkling in that second tier, they'd be paying $5.46. So we set the tier 1 rate at that, for the sprinklers, at that rate. And then, so we just had 3 tiers for the sprinkler rates. Now, if we were to, you know, apply this same structure then to the commercial users, you know, it's probably reasonable, because they probably don't have huge properties that they're irrigating.
So do you plug that on top of the 6,000? How do you know if it's a sprinkler?
It's a
Separate, yep.
Oh, it's separate.
They would,
So more than likely that's commercial. You do
There's some residential, as in there's some duplexes or fourplexes where they have a separate meter for the rental, but there's a meter for the landlord to pay for the sprinkler. So there's some of both. It's easier if it's just one charge, whether it's just a sprinkler meter or this charge, because if it's a sprinkler meter, you're watering your lawn, so therefore you should have one rate, whether it's commercial or residential, in my opinion.
and they pay a fixed charge on that as well, right, for the months that they use it?
Right now, yeah.
Yes. Oh, but did they pay a meter charge as well, the $7.85?
They pay their base plus their.
Yep.
that'll just make it all the same. Are we trying to, I mean, so we want to conserve water, so are we giving them an incentive if we have a sprinkler rate?
Yes, because the first gallon of water through that irrigation meter is going to cost more than the first gallon out of their faucet.
Great.
It's going to be at the tier 2 rate.
Okay.
So,
That's okay.
yeah. Any other questions about that approach?
Does any residential have a separate sprinkler line?
Single family.
No, single family residential, no.
Is it available? Is it an option for people? No?
Right now.
Okay.
It can be.
Why would you want it so at this point? If we did that.
Well,
We want it.
the advantage, at least most of the time when we see that, is they don't get charged sewer on that. And so if you're watering, you know,
Which is why we do the winter average, though.
but if you're winter averaging, it may not be an issue, but that's usually why we see that. Any other questions on that? Okay, so, you know, at this point, we have done some revenue adequacy analysis to come up with the rates that you saw on those different scenarios. And I was just I didn't want to spend a lot of time on this, because I think we really just need to identify what, you're most comfortable with in terms of your rates. But I'll just explain to you briefly what we did. So for in terms of the fixed charges, again, like I said, we assumed to calculate those volumetric options, we assumed that these charges would be adopted. Now, to make things cash flow as your debt comes on in the next few years, we did assume implementation of some additional debt surcharge on top of that. So you can see in 2021, for the purpose of revenue adequacy, we kept the O&M rate at $9.25, but we added another $3 for a total of $4 in debt surcharge per month onto the bill, the smallest bills, and again scaled that up by meter size. For 2022, we added another $1.40 for a total of $5.40 in debt component of that fixed meter charge. In 2023, that $5.40 becomes $7.29 under the scenario I'm showing you here, and then in 2024, that becomes $9.84. So by 2024, about a little bit more than half of your total monthly fixed charge, which for your smallest meter would be $19.09, as we've modeled it here, over half of that would be associated with the debt surcharge. And that's where we come. Sorry.
A lot of major infrastructure projects that you have no clue whether we're actually going to do or how much they're
Right.
going to cost, really. I mean, just estimates.
Correct. I mean, it's basically.
Based off well 8, which we're doing, and we will borrowing, one water tower, the water treatment plant, and right now it's based off, the WRT for well 7. So I think those are only the top.
Right, that's all that's in the CIP right now. So it's $6 million in debt coming on in 2020, and then another 23-ish million in 2023.
I should add, it's also the core.
And yes, I'm sorry, the ramping up of the core reconstruction phases is also included in there. And then in addition, the 2020 budget, we've assumed 3% increases annually just as a projection for these future years.
What do you have in there for the water treatment plant?
$20.5 million for the plant, plus it's right around 3 for the WRT connection to well 7, just to have a placeholder. And we know that I think that hasn't been fully decided yet, correct?
Correct.
Right. So we wanted to use kind of a representative placeholder for the purpose of calculating debt service. We did assume, so for the $6 million in debt for the current projects, we assumed a 20-year term at 2.5% interest. For the water plant, we assumed a 30-year term for the debt, because that is reasonable for a project like that. So that did bring the debt charge down a little bit. One thing we did do to ensure the debt surcharge would be adequate, we did calculate that over a 20-year term instead of 30 years. So that is something that could potentially be adjusted. So what this looks like, so when we put all this in the revenue adequacy model with the selected rates and the projected revenue requirements, we come up with the revenue adequacy graphic. And what this is the green is the projected revenue by year, the blue is the projected revenue requirements, and then the red is whether we're showing a surplus revenue or deficient revenue in years. And so this red bar is the 1.3 million that you're planning to use from cash, and so that's not a problem. That is something that has been planned all along, and so that's nothing that we're concerned about. And so then we show for 2021 under the projected rates, a slight revenue surplus that we use up then in 2023 when we are projecting a small deficit, and then in 2024 getting back on track to have a revenue surplus. And so when we model this, we want to look at, we don't want to be projecting something like this out into the future, because that's not a good financial plan. So then the part that everyone's interested in that comes with this that's very important is what do the rates look like that go along with that. And this is just, I use scenario 2 here as an example. So this is just, print these in the newspaper or anything tomorrow. But under this, just to give you an idea of what this could look like, under the fixed charge increases that I showed you a few minutes ago, we would need some increases as well in the volumetric rates. So a 12% increase in 2021 in the volumetric portion, 17.5% in 2022, 16 in 2023, and 16.5 in 2024.
And that's in addition to the fixed rate?
Yes, this is simply an increase in the rate, in the volumetric rate. Yes, in the volumetric rate. Yes, those increases were, so 30% in 2020, almost 30% again, at 11, 13, and then a 15 in those fixed rates. So this is just, a first cut at one way to make this work. And so this is the picture that kind of brings it all together. What we're trying to do here is we want to, if we have a operating reserve target of 180 days, so we want to show the utility will have adequate cash to meet that through the period. The green is capital. It's essentially unrestricted cash in excess of the operating reserve, but even though you're investing significantly in capital reserves are something that still need to be considered at this point. So we're calling this capital reserve that you can use for your CIP, the meters and other things in future years. The blue is the debt surcharge that would be accumulated and not spent each year. And so you can see that we're projecting that you will generate more surcharge than you need in these years. The idea there being is you could pay down that debt faster if you chose. Alternately, we could go and reduce those surcharge components of the rate to generate less. But it's going to be really important that you are setting your rates up to cover that debt. And so the surcharge is we're going to have to decide how to do that. The pink here is just in it. So we've said for a capital reserve target, we always talk about, for you, we suggest 1 year of depreciation at a minimum. And so that's just under $400,000 we've said is your target here. We're not actively funding that right now because you're putting more of that annually into your system through principal payments and stuff. And so, but it is something that we track on this. And so the pink is unrestricted cash in excess of the O&M reserve, capital reserve, and the debt surcharge reserve, and we're just calling that rate stabilization revenue.
Debt service reserve, we could adjust that a bit to try to reduce it from the 30%. It's like blue, is that where we have some wiggle room?
Yes.
We don't want to take too much away because we've got to look towards the future.
Right.
But we also have to balance that with our taxpayers.
Right. Well, and the other thing that drives some of that is you have to meet coverage as well. 110% coverage, correct? Yep. So, sometimes, unfortunately, that requirement alone will drive a rate increase, but that is something that needs to be balanced as we evaluate.
I guess I would be curious what our coverage percentage, what it would be then if we have it weighted now, what you're projecting.
It's huge right now, so we don't have any debt. It really come into play when we do the water treatment plant, that's when it's come into play.
That's
Well, 2022 start construction, go online 2023.
so we got a couple of years.
And I think, and I should say, we always are very conservative in our assumptions here. So once you select how you want to move forward with rates, we can take a better look at that and see, well, how will those payments actually come in based on how you plan to spend the money, and we can refine that. So here I'm showing, I don't know if you can see that, but showing calculating debt service coverage for these first few years, well above what's needed simply because you have no existing debt. In FY13 at 124%, and then good after that because your debt surcharge has ramped up at that point to where it needs to be. So,
Well, I don't think that's wild and crazy, because we want to be conservative.
I have a question, just thinking overall for this, that those are huge increases, and obviously, if it needs to be done, it needs to be done. But, and I could be wrong, because I wasn't part of this, and I'm only saying this because it goes together, the water and sewer. The sewage rate, from what I was told as a citizen, was it jumped up because at one time, the city was looking at building their own plant, correct? So we wanted to kind of do a cushion. Since then, we have gone away from that, and thankfully, we're sending literally our shit to Sioux Falls to let them handle it, right?
Yep.
So why do we still have that huge increase? Is there a way that we could take 2%, 3% off, and so then it won't be such a low blow when they get their water bill?
No,
Can't do it that way?
no, because the fee that we are paying to Sioux Falls currently is equal to about the debt service that we would pay if we built our own plant.
Really?
Yeah, that's it.
Well, we are saving,
Plus,
because
we
we have
did-
the manpower, and I don't think we have.
We didn't build our own plant, but we did do a biosolids reconstruction, was 240.
And the lift station.
And we did the lift station.
But in essence, when we did the original rates for the sewer projection, we were talking about a $15 million treatment plant.
But that's not, that's just the plant, that wasn't,
That wasn't,
employees.
no,
It's my understanding, there's some high-paid individuals that keep that plant running afloat.
over at Sioux Falls?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah,
That we, obviously, I don't know, we would
no.
be able to dish out a couple six figures.
When we did the original wastewater study, we were looking at about a $15 million Sager system is what they called it, a glorified aeration basin. As we evaluated that, it became apparent that the Sager system would not be adequate for the city of Brandon, so we would have to go to a mechanical facility, similar, smaller in size than Sioux Falls, but that's a mechanical facility. And I think that price was 25. I think it was 25
Basically, though, we
million.
don't have any wiggle room. We increased it to build it, and then, okay.
So
That was what I was trying to
If
figure
we
out.
borrow 25 million to build a municipal wastewater plant over a 20-year time, that's a little over $1 million a year in debt service. Well, that's kind of what we're paying Sioux Falls to treat our waste.
But yeah, but that was just, yeah, and that's fine. I just, you know, when it jumped up so much, I'm just trying to figure out how we can try to balance it out and not have it such a huge hit.
I mean, it's not, from a dollar standpoint, it's not huge per month, but the percentage is.
yeah,
So, you know, depends on how you position it too.
right. Yeah, we would definitely want to talk about dollars, especially in talking about the fixed charge. You probably caught this, but this line up here, this is the annual increase in revenue. So total revenue generated for the utility, just with the configuration of rates that we put together for this scenario, generates a 17% increase in revenue each year through 2024. So that's what I had to run past you. So I guess, you know, now I just need some direction as far as what we should use as we finalize the final revenue adequacy scenario and make some, you know, our solid recommendations on what to do with rates for 2020. You know, where do you feel you need to go in terms of these scenarios, or is there, you know, an alternate scenario? You want to modify any of these?
So are we saying 2020, like the first quarter? I mean, we're 2020's in 2 weeks.
Yeah, what Christine and I talked about, if we kind of agree on a scenario tonight, we would implement the rates for the February bill. It'll take a while, because Doris and/or Christine have to go through the individual accounts and classify those as residential, non-residential, residential 4 units. That's going to take a while. So we'd be looking at the February billing. All goes well.
I think it's important to get it in place soon before we start in the throes of a recession. Would be the last thing we want to be doing when that happens.
You are always a pessimist. You're
Well, it's gonna happen at some
about
point.
recession.
We've had a bull market for 11 years. It's gonna happen.
It is.
On the residential rate design, I don't know how the rest of the council's feeling, but I would definitely favor scenario 2 more than 1. And if anything, I would almost like to see either tier 1 go to like 10,000 or leave it where it's at and have tier 2 go to 25,000. I struggle a little bit with, because we want to get the individual waterers that are putting the water on their lawn accessibly. But I just hesitate to say this. I mean, if Dave's getting to 22,000 and I don't think Dave waters very often, he's going to be in tier 3, which is kind of a penalty tier. We were kind of saying that as soon as you go outside and wash your car a couple times or let your kids run through this sprinkler for an hour, you're paying more. So get back to that quality of life discussion.
So what are you saying, 20?
Well, I don't know, just brainstorming. I mean, I guess, like, I just did a quick math on, and I don't know if this is right or not, but on the 22,000 example, I came up with like $100 now, and it would go to 122. I mean, it's like 22%. And it didn't feel like that was a month that was a lot of usage. But it's using that number that we threw out from Dave's.
Staff have any recommendations?
I think when we set those tiers, tier 1 should take into account your normal domestic consumption, which is about 6,000 gallons on average. And then you need to accommodate a reasonable watering amount based upon, the average size of the yard here in town is, it's about 7,000, 7,100 square feet of grass. It's kind of a normal yard. We average somewhere between 2 and 3 inches of rain in June, July, and August each month. So 1 inch of rain per week is what the requirement is. So if you get 2 inches of rain, that's about a half inch of rain a week on average. So if you look at a half inch of rain, or half inch of sprinkling each week. So you're looking at a little over 2 inches of sprinkling.
Mm-hmm.
So if you can
Yeah.
set your tier 1 at normal domestic use and then a half inch of watering a week.
What does it take?
And that,
How many gallons for a half inch?
that's the 12,000 that we calculate, this number here. So when we added that to the 6, yep, to get to 18, yep.
Within the different scenarios, do you have a recommendation?
One, I think, is too harsh at the 6. I mean, if we didn't have, if we weren't going to build a treatment plant, we weren't going to dig wells, I'd say, yeah, we really need the hammer. 4, I think, might be a little too liberal. So 2 and 3, or maybe a 2.5. 8 might be a little low. 16 might be a little high. So if you split the difference, it maybe 12, 0 to 12 for that first tier.
That's kind of where I was at too.
And then
Okay.
go
Added
12 to 20
20.
or 24. I think
Yeah,
if we make the tiers bigger, we'll have to increase the rates in tiers 2, 3, and 4
mm-hmm.
to generate the same amount of revenue.
So if you go 12, so that's normal household and half of what they would need for lawn. Because we said 12.
Yeah, that'd be a half inch a week of watering.
I mean, we don't want to, people want to have green grass. We don't wanna-
And folks also got a garden.
Similar
Yeah.
mindset that I have, we gotta give these people somewhat of a chance to water their lawn. We can't just come in and say, you're not watering at all. I just,
Can't be Nazis.
I don't like that.
No,
We want to catch the people that are using it
Yep.
and wasting it.
Is that fair?
Yep, I agree with that. Yep.
Close.
Mindset of the council?
12 and 24.
You know,
Okay,
you gotta give them a chance to water their lawn. Yeah,
Sounds
we're ready to bankrupt.
Yep, but you have to catch the abusers.
But yet not go fall winter.
Okay,
Quote you on that?
Maybe go 12,
That's-
or 36, and then tier 4 is anything over 36, maybe that.
okay, that sounds like a good plan. So then for irrigation, are we okay then with having it be 0 to 24, 24 to 36, and above 36?
So Kevin, from the Water Conservation Committee standpoint, you think we could use those numbers to work with?
I think that's more than reasonable, and frankly, just implementing any sort of tiered system will help educate users to, like, watch their water bill and see how much they're using, and we're doing the responsible thing by allowing and trying to accommodate some level of lawn watering, but acknowledging, first, if you continue to violate the odd even restrictions in water every day or overwater, you will not only be penalized potentially by the city with a citation, but you're penalizing yourself because you're going to pay more for that water. So there is a financial disincentive to be in the top tier, but I think we're recognizing that for those residents who are trying to do the right thing, we're allowing a reasonable amount of water to be used outdoors. It sends a good message.
And to look at it more globally, Kevin, there's a lot of issues in this area, this country with water. And everything I read, you're going to be seeing or hearing these conversations that we're having in every podunk town, every big town. The can has been kicked down the road in almost, I read some article, 97% of the communities, the can has been kicked down the road. The can is about blown up.
Well, and you mentioned it, Pier is doing a water treatment plant, so their rates are going to increase. Yankton had to laugh, and A2S's 2019 study didn't put their new water rates in.
Well, they're in the bottom of the graph, they're way up.
We added them.
They're way up.
They added that, 'cause we said, hey, what's Yankton going to do?
My point on this whole comment, tell me, Kevin, that this is a conversation, and it's a trend, that Brandon is not the only community in the area that's going to be having these conversations, that's going to be seeing these rate increases.
Within the water industry, there's so much discussion right now about the responsible management of water resources and delayed deferred infrastructure, repair and replacement, that if communities are not planning for it right now, they'll be hit with a brick wall of improvements that they're going to need to make if they're not planning ahead and trying to, like Miranda was showing you, this isn't just a one-year snapshot. This is a financial plan for the water utility of Brandon, so it can be resilient if and when there's another recession, that the water utility will always be able to provide what we need for domestic uses. We're trying to accommodate some outdoor water use, but we have to be responsible in what we have available and how we use it and how we replace it. So some communities have not, Mayor, and those that don't, or those that are consistently on the low end of rates that say we're proud that we've got the lowest rates in the state, I would not want to be in their shoes.
I mean, even the city of Sioux Falls having major conversations about their rates and the expenses that they're going to be incurring in the near and immediate future.
Every community, Sioux Falls, most of the clients we work with
Yeah.
are
Oh.
looking at this right now,
Yeah.
or they have been for years.
Hey, we could have solved this if we had just hooked up to Lewis and Clark.
Yeah.
We could have solved this.
1993.
Well,
No, because it was only 250,000 gallons a day.
but even those members of Lewis and Clark, even that system is looking at its next expansion at what they call Lewis and Clark 2. So you can never plan far enough ahead for your water resources because they're frankly not that easy to find, especially around here. But ignoring the problem is not an alternative.
You know, and these numbers are far from anywhere near humorous to me. I mean, they're gut-wrenching. These numbers are big numbers when you get out there.
Yeah.
Look at the packet on page, that's a lot. existing charge and then the different alternatives and what it will change. Now, keep in mind that bills are gonna change no matter what, because we're changing the fixed rate. But this will kind of give you an idea on, the alternatives too, and kind of where they get hit maybe a little more with that water.
Yeah, and I guess I should say, don't go too far down that chart, because like I said, there's not a lot of water use beyond, 2024. We ran it out just, I don't know why we ran it out to 60, but
There is for
a couple?
new homes.
Okay, all right. Well, yeah, no. And the other thing I wanted to point out is, the projections, they are, they're not happy numbers to look at, but you guys will have this model then to, adjust this is something you're going to want to look at every year. I don't want you to adopt what we put up there on the screen, for 5 years. You're going to want to look at it every year, and hopefully things will be better than, like I said, we're very conservative in estimating revenue requirements. We tend to be a little, conservative in estimating revenues as well. So usually, hopefully, it's a better picture than that.
Yeah, and let's not go throwing around 30%, because in people's minds, they're probably gonna base that on $100. That's $30 a month, which is far from what it's gonna be. It's gonna be a couple bucks. So
So-
let's be careful with our language on this.
So at 12,000 gallons a month, the bill would be somewhere around $64. I'm figuring that right.
Well, currently about 63, and if we would,
The alternative two would be 68, yeah.
So-
close to 69.
about $6 a month.
So
$7.
that's
And that's next year.
Yeah.
And that's a 9.2%.
I'm on 23.
Sure,
I'm not on.
I didn't bring my calculator.
I'm just thinking about, so the
Look at
fixed rate is 10.25.
Yes.
What is fixed rate?
Yep.
At least on this one. Yes?
Yep.
And then the rate per gallon is 4.50.
Sure.
4.50 per thousand.
Oh, yep.
There you go, too.
Yeah, 450, yeah.
They'll base
Well,
it
that's
on
64.
Those percentages are.
Yeah, they are, but they'll figure it's $30 a month.
Yep.
I guarantee it. So
Well-
let's not, and I'm not trying to be lack of transparency or anything. We all know what it is, but that gets in the paper. Let's just be cautious what we say.
Yeah, I think to focus on the impact to an average resident in Brandon is the message.
Per month.
This is what, and to weave into it the value of water, not just the cost.
But I would like to produce a dollar amount, not a percentage rate.
Exactly, yeah. And I think we
So if the dollar rate is $2, $3, that's a lot easier to stomach than.
Yeah, so this table could be dollars instead of percentages in that column.
people base their lives on what numbers, and that's how they think, so we want it per month.
I mean, we could even put on the website a calculator of some sort that said, hey, check your last month's water bill, plug the numbers in, and it will show you what the change is.
Yeah.
Yeah,
20,000 gallons.
I don't even know how much I use.
most people don't. When you talk, and I've said this before, you say, hey, the average home is, or the average user is, everybody equates themselves to house. Even if you live in a $400,000 house, my house is average. No, the average is $229,000.
Okay, so let's get out ahead of this with Jill before she comes to a meeting and here's 30%, somebody says it. Let's have somebody sit down with her once we, have some numbers and give her the actual numbers. And I know Kevin can write a nice article for water conservation at some time.
We can do that. The other thing that we need to include is, you gotta remember, all of this stuff is being driven by a water tower and a treatment plant.
It's gonna be my next point, that you have to get that message out there, that
Yep.
these fees are being used to fund,
Project.
future projects to make our water better.
And why we need a,
If we don't do these rates, we can't do a treatment plant. If we don't do a treatment plant, we might as well just shut down
Yeah.
building permits. Because we're,
Or lawnmower. You just shut down lawnmower,
Yeah.
and it would be fine.
can the swimmers that go up to the water, like the shower heads? Or is that all been used? It's gone for this year? Oh, yeah, for this year, that's awesome. Yeah, I'm glad
Well,
everybody came in.
You know, to that point, the things that the Water Conservation Committee has done, I think, is in anticipation of finding ways for customers who say, I want to conserve water. Well, we've tried to do what we can so far through public education and some of the rebate programs to help those individuals, if they're truly interested in keeping their water usage and then their water rates as affordable as possible, that, you know, this is part of a multi-pronged approach. It isn't just, here's your water rate, we hope you can live within it. We've also spent the last year or so with you folks coming up with ways to help people conserve water, especially outdoors, if they're truly interested in managing their own water usage.
We have a water barrel.
So there's disincentives and there's incentives, and we're doing both.
And you gotta remember, this is a huge change for the city of Brandon as an organization, because for years, we promoted water use. We encouraged people to water away, because it was a revenue stream for us. So,
Mindset.
yeah, it's a huge thing. We go from encouraging it to somewhat,
Well, trying to manage it. So being responsible so people can have green lawns, but we've also got enough water for the future, for domestic uses. And Mayor, I think to one of your points earlier, this is not a set it and forget it model that every year, the city doesn't need a water rate study every year, but with the model that Brian and Christina will have, you'll be able to update some of those capital numbers
we put
every
those
year.
numbers in.
And operations and maintenance costs, and maybe for the next year, it's not 16%, it's 14, or the equivalent dollar amount. So I think it's just as important that every year you go back to that model and see, well, how did we do this year? Were sales up, down, were costs up or down? And then you can make that decision as a council annually, but you're looking at it every single year, not just setting it and forget it and say, well, we'll revisit it again in 5 years, and that's generally not a good approach to financial planning. I mean, you wouldn't do it personally, so you certainly don't want to do it with utility funds.
Rates could change drastically depending on if you go to RO system or not on the treatment plant. I mean, it's huge. And I think the water rates will set 1 year is what you guys are saying, then set 1 year, like don't do 4 like we did the sewer. Because we'll have that spreadsheet where we can plug in what changed this year, are we doing this year, are we holding on, so we can plug those in.
Because the sewer, we pretty much know. We don't have any major capital projects for the sewer. Or water we do. So when the treatment plant comes in at 10 million instead of 20, we can adjust those rates. On that.
Is that what you got plugged in there at 29?
Yeah.
23
Yeah.
between the treatment plant and the
And the
WRT
well,
system.
yeah.
And well 3 connection.
Yeah.
That was
Earlier
included.
on, I heard you guys throw these acronyms around like I know what you're talking about. What's WRT?
WRT is a radium removal system that would be located at well 7. So if we started using well 7, it would filter out the radium, basically a radium water filter, for lack of better terms. That would be installed at the well. And then that water coming out of well 7 would go from 15 to a 20 picocuries per liter to 0.
Because that is a higher
That's-
radium
yep.
well, is that correct?
Yep.
Yeah,
At some point in time, we'll bring that through the treatment plant to see how our current treatment plant treats that water, and get it down below 5. But the WRT system is a filtration system done by a private company. They put in a big filter outside of the pump house. The water would go through there, the filter media would take out the radium, and eventually that filter media would get used up. That company would come in, take that filter media out, dispose of it properly, and put new media in.
How much does that cost?
To take it out and
No, to put that,
to replace the media.
no, to
Oh,
put
the
that in the system.
Oh, 3 million.
But from a political standpoint, to use well 7, I think we're gonna have to do that. Otherwise, we'll never.
We'll have to do
get it
something at
through.
well 7
Something.
to get that down.
And certainly with the volume of water that is within the Split Rock Creek Aquifer, as far as that being a long-term valued water supply for the city of Brandon, that's absolutely worth pursuing.
So,
I don't know for sure if that's an accurate statement, right, Kevin? Didn't I just contract you guys to prove that to be an accurate
Well,
statement?
it's worth pursuing, and that's one of the reasons that that's why you've got WSP right now looking at a more refined groundwater model to show where the best locations are and what sort of yield and recharge there is. So if we don't, or if the community doesn't continue to investigate that, that was not our recommendation, was continue to look for it, to look at it.
and we'll start working with Lewis and Clark, but Lewis and Clark 2 is 20 plus years down the road. So we can,
That's where they'll come talk, right?
yep, we are. So I think they'd be more than happy to bring us in, not as a member, but as a customer. And we would get a lot of water, but that's 20 years down the road, so, or more. So we've got to bridge that.
Well, I know when I talked to him, he said, yeah, ideally, in 20, 30 years, we don't know, because that's like anything, none of us, you can't predict, so what's gonna happen, so, I guess my discussion with him was like, it'd just be interesting, I think all of us need to kind of hear and know that spring and play for the table.
And we've told them that, but we'll bring them in probably January, February,
See if we can
just to chit chat.
yeah, that would be nice.
So in summary, their marching orders is,
12, 24, 36.
2.5 level of college.
Yep.
12,000 gallons, something like that.
I like that.
Do whatever you do to make that.
Okay.
And then try to get some of your charts more non-percentage and dollar amounts.
Yes.
Is that what I'm hearing in summary?
Well, I think,
Yes,
yes,
we gotta get rolling on this.
Okay.
We need to get the word out as to why the rates are changing. We've got a couple of big projects coming, and then start working on some type of a calculator that we get away from the percentage. It's gonna be $4 a month or $10, whatever it is.
One more question, Christina, are you sure your software program can handle all these different, whatever they're doing?
It's just Excel. isn't it?
Yes.
This,
it
Yes.
can.
the Tyler Technologies. Yeah.
Does-
Billing system, you're
That's why
sure
it's-
that it will handle that?
Yes, it will, it's just a lot of, yes, work.
It's one of the reasons why, if you remember,
One of the reasons why I need at least 6 weeks to implement it.
if you remember, we were looking at rates based on winter averages. Tyler Technologies isn't real committal that they can get that done. That's why we've kind of removed that scenario and gone with the hard tiered system instead of the multiplier with winter average for water. Because they can't guarantee us, yeah, we'll have this up and running for you by February.
So if one month I use 12,000, the next month I use 24,000, it's gonna adjust that rate right away.
Yep.
So it'll be current.
Yeah, you'll pay the tier 1 rate for the first 12,000 in that 24,000 month, and then the tier 2 rate for the second 12,000.
That is
Yeah.
good because that's instant gratification or instant, don't like it.
Signal, yeah.
Yeah, that will be good.
All
And
right.
with the new bills, we'll show usage
Yeah,
on there.
doing the new bills this year is gonna help a lot on that and the consumption.
So you have your March orders.
When you come back.
If there's no other comments on the non-residential, and then yes, I know what we need to do.
So we need you guys to get that
Yes.
rather quickly, right?
Yep, we're planning on January 6th.
We'll go to that.
having a
January
resolution
6th.
In front of the council with the rates.
Okay.
Bill,
We're
just
just
devil's
guys.
advocate real quick on the percentage. I guess I'm not opposed to the percentages being on here because that's very reflective of what the consequences are versus a dollar amount. That doesn't really send a signal.
Yeah, but when you're selling insurance, wouldn't you rather say $20 a month versus 30%?
I think we're looking too far down on this though, because some of these are so
Yeah.
small.
I would
And
say
the
if you
correct,
can do another one of these for
Yeah.
me with the.
With the dollar
stuff,
amounts.
The dollar amounts, then I can use this to post.
I mean, we're
Okay.
talking 3%, 4%,
Yeah, some
6%.
of them are pretty small.
Right.
Yeah.
And if somebody calls in, we can certainly look at the chart and go, hey, you used 5,000 gallons last
But
month.
that's an abuse.
Mhm.
It is a big change for us when the tier rates with the constant system, you can say, yeah, you're
Right.
tier rates.
Make a motion to adjourn.
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
All in favor, aye. Aye. Miranda, that's hour, 6:34.
When you dream at night, is it charts and graphs?
When you dream, is it all in charts and graphs?
Pretty much, yeah. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.